Hello and welcome to this lecture. This is week 4 and my name is Dr. Neil Soggie. This course is ancient history, history of the ancient Near East and ancient Greece. Within this week's lecture, we have a larger theme and we're still looking at the late Bronze Age period. And in this lecture, we will be taking a look at Proto-Israel. So this will be through the time of the Hyksos in Egypt through to Proto-Israelite wanderings and settlement, and then through to the development of a unified kingdom. Now, maybe I should just speak a little bit about the biblical text and some edits and a bit about the timeline here. A lot of the information that we have is taken from the Pentateuch. The Pentateuch is literally means the 5 books. So we have the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Now we should keep in mind that while tradition says that Moses wrote these books, there's obviously different portions of these books that were not written by Moses. And we see that very obviously because within these books there's accounts of Moses' death and burial. What scholars tend to view the works as multiple sources being stitched together over a period of several hundred years and really kind of coming into form around the time of Hezekiah. There's something known as the JEDP theory that says that the first 5 books of the Bible, so Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, were not written entirely by Moses, who died, and according to the biblical timeline, died around in the 1400s, but by different authors and compilers who lived after Moses. And the theory is based on the fact that there's different names for God are used in different portions of the books, along with detectable differences in linguistic style. The letters of the JEDP theory stand for the 4 supposed major authors or redactors. One who uses Jehovah for God's name, one who uses Elohim, the other of Deuteronomy, and the priestly author of Leviticus. The higher critical theory of JEDP goes on to propose that the different portions of the Pentateuch were compiled through Hezekiah, the time period with Judah in the 600s, and then more formalized in the Second Temple period, so the time of Ezra after the Babylonian exile. And part of this has to do with other internal textual indications as well. So just want you to keep that in mind. I personally have done a lot of work on the late Bronze Age literature related to the book of Joshua, and I'm very confident to tell you that this book is a stitching together of multiple sources, and some of them seem to have been written fairly early, and others seem to have gone through an oral tradition structure before they were stitched together into the final book. So just want you to be mindful of that. The other thing that I want to highlight here is a very basic thing, but I think it's one that's important. In textual biblical literature, the Exodus is normally set at 1446. Now, if you watch the Hollywood movies, they will typically place the Exodus during the time of Ramses II. So they will actually name the pharaoh and talk to Ramses. Most of the movies do that. Part of the reason they do that is if you look at the archaeological evidence in Israel, you see a sedentary people forming and settling in Israel shortly after the time of Ramses II. And it's very distinct and very strong. And so some will argue that that is the time period for it. I view it a little bit differently. It's not that I don't know about that. What I would argue is that this ignores the textual evidence. This ignores the different phases and transitions that Proto-Israel went through and creates a very simplistic model. Semi-nomadic peoples typically do not leave strong archaeological evidence. And you have the record of them living as semi-nomadic people for hundreds of years before they start to settle down. And there's good indication for that. There's other extra biblical evidence from different sources as well that tie in with this, as well as some literary evidence that is fairly strong. So I'm going to go with the 1446 period of the Exodus in this lecture, recognizing that, like all history, there's debate about these things. So I just want you to be mindful of that and recognize that there is this debate that goes on. So let's take a look at Exodus and note a few things about an introduction to Exodus. So a few words of introduction to the book of Exodus. Let's remind ourselves again of the setting. Exodus begins with Israel living securely in Egypt. So you have the Semitic people living in Egypt. They were guests of the Pharaoh who protects them because of Joseph's service to Egypt. And this is taken from the story in Genesis. Yet by the end of this time, Israel resides outside of Egypt. The story goes that they escaped slavery from Egypt and they moved toward the land where they felt that they had received a divine promise to possess this land. And Moses has become their leader. So much happens within this time period that it's important to just kind of be mindful that there's lots of transitions that are taking place here. So about the time period. Now, you can recall Abraham lived around 2000 BC or shortly thereafter. And when we get to the chapters of 1st and 2nd Exodus, we meet the character Moses. And we find out that through comparing biblical texts written from other nations and from archaeological evidence and from internal literary evidence, that Moses probably lived around 1500 through to 1450 BCE. So Moses lives really about 500 years after Abraham. So there's this large gap in there with just a few editorial comments about what went on there. So when Israel leaves Egypt around 1446 BCE, part of the evidence for that is taken from a quote-unquote historical book. And, for ancient times, 1 Kings really is as good as we could hope for a historical book. And here it says that King Solomon, the third king of Israel, built a temple 480 years after Israel left Egypt. And because of what we know from this record, and because of what we know about archaeological texts and being able to reconstruct things, we can put the completion of Solomon's temple somewhere between 966 and 960. So we add that up. 480 years gives us somewhere between 1446 and 1440 BCE. Now, during this time, Egypt was a very strong nation. They'd gone through a period of weakness right before this era, but at this time, Egypt was undergoing a flowering of culture. Their writing was impressive, their science was impressive, their technology was growing, their religious scope was expanding, their military might had exceeded everything that had come before it. So this is a great time in history for Egypt. If you look at the British Museum or museums around the world, you find artwork from this period that shows the Pharaoh at the height of Pharaoh's glory. So we see a bit about the setting and about the historical background to the book. So let's take a look at what's going on here with the story as it plays itself out. Now, first off, it's important to note that there is no irrefutable supporting evidence, but plenty of contextual evidence for the general outline of the story of Exodus. Now, the Hyksos were known as Semitic peoples in Lower Egypt. And this is the background of the people of Israel, the same ethnic background. They're Semitic people, and it records at Exodus that Israel lived in the land of Goshen, which is a region in Lower Egypt. And what we know from Egyptian records is that the father of some boys, Moses and Moses, was killed in a fight against the Hyksos. And then Moses was killed the same way. And Moses finally subjugated the Hyksos. And there are reports of subordinates of Moses taking Hyksos slaves. So in terms of context for the Exodus story, this fits with the general political climate of the time. Also, it's interesting that the Pharaoh is not named in the Exodus. The Exodus and the time leading up to it was a time where there was actually some confusion that went on. Because remember, this is the time of the co-regent Hatshepsut, the stepmother of Thutmose III. So it may be that it was not entirely clear who was the real authority at the time. And so it's also important to note that upon her death, Thutmose III had Hatshepsut all but erased from the records of being a ruler. So lots of things that went on here. Thutmose, we know, was very careful to craft his story within history. So it's not surprising that a negative story about Israel would not be part of that. Now, just a little bit about Exodus chapters 1 through to 18. When we look at the different portions of this book, we see a few important things that we should highlight. The first is that in the first 4 chapters of Exodus 1 to 18, we see an emphasis on Semitic enslavement and on Moses' call to be a ruler. We read in chapter 1 of Exodus that after Jacob and Joseph died, and leads up to this story about how the Egyptians had filled up, or the Israelites had filled up the land of Goshen, and the Egyptians in southern Egypt did not like this and decided to enslave the descendants of Abraham. And that's what we see in this time. There's lots of textual evidence, extra biblical textual evidence, that there was campaigns against the Hyksos at this time. And I'm arguing that on some level, at least, the Hyksos, that can be used and understood as the same peoples that were talked about in the book of Exodus. Now, You have to kind of keep in mind that people speak of people in different ways. For example, in America and Canada in World War II, we spoke about being at war with the Germans. Well, Germany didn't call themselves Germany; they called themselves Deutschland. I used to go to Italy in the summers to go to academic conferences, and I would buy a ticket to go fly into Florence, Italy. When you arrive in Italy, there's no place called Florence in Italy. For Italians, the city of Florence is called Firenze. So you just need to kind of keep in mind that there's always a little bit of a cultural difference in the way that we tell stories about people and about locations. So you need to kind of keep all of that in mind as we look at the story as well. Now, within the book of Exodus then, because these people were not free, and because there was oppression by the Egyptians, it's told that the Pharaoh attempts to kill all the Jewish male babies to try to limit their numbers so that they don't overwhelm the people of Lower Egypt. And so we have this story of Moses being put in a basket and sent down the river and then adopted by the Pharaonic household and raised in royalty. Now, part of that might be just simply a good story to help legitimize his rule over the Israelite people. After all, that's the same story that is the background story for Sargon the Great. And we all know Sargon means legitimate ruler. But it may be that that's just simply the way that things were done in the ancient world, that people are always around the rivers. You know that's where people are going to be, and so that's the way that you would ensure that someone would adopt a child, whatever it may be. Despite Moses' mistakes, the story is that there's a divine call on Moses to go and try to free these Semitic peoples from Pharaoh. And within that, then, Moses goes and confronts the Pharaoh. And as this goes on, the Israelites, they're not happy. The Egyptians aren't happy, but eventually they are set free. Now, just want to kind of remind again, and I did mention this a little bit. Now, I just want to mention a little bit more about the redactors. And there is an interesting historical parallel that happens here as far as the context of the story. So as I mentioned, in the story, the Semites are the victims, and as a result, Moses is set adrift on the river. And he's taken into the household of the Pharaoh and later becomes the ruler, the legitimate ruler of the people of Israel, Proto-Israel. Now, if the redactors didn't add this, and it is historical, then it's a remarkable coincidence. But it certainly, either way, is going to lend some strength to the story of Moses. Now, as far as extra-textual evidence that we have, there's the fact that Thutmose III's eldest son, Amenemhat, dies. Now, not an unusual thing in and of itself, but this does fit the Exodus account. Amenemhat was a prince of Thutmose III. He was the son of the Pharaoh, and the name of Amenemhat was mentioned on an inscription in the Karnak temple in the 24th year, shortly after the death of Hatshepsut. So this would be before the Exodus would have occurred. And prior to, and so it would have been very shortly after his father had become Pharaoh. Now, what we know is that Amenemhat was appointed as the overseer of the cattle. And this is a really weird title for a prince. But he was named that in that year. So before the Exodus, he was named as overseer of the cattle. And he's also depicted in a tomb, the tomb of his tutor. So we have a couple of indications of Amenemhat's living. But we know that he dies before Thutmose does. So following the theophany of the burning bush and Moses returning to Egypt, by the way, all Bronze Age stories of conquest or have mentions of gods in them. It's just the way that stories were communicated in the Bronze Age. So this is not in any way out of step with the style for communicating what went on as far as factual activities. And what we have is some plagues that were sent upon the people. And the plagues, many scholars believe, were sent in order to insult the Egyptian gods. Or at least that's how the story has been redacted out. So I do want to kind of walk through a little bit of this and just show a little bit of what some of these are. So the first plague within the story is that the Egyptians, that the water of the Nile turns to blood, turns red. It's polluted. And in the minds of the ancient people, they would recognize this as insulting the Egyptian god Hapi, who was the Egyptian god of the Nile. And this Egyptian god was a water bearer. The second plague that was extended upon Egypt from the rod by Aaron, who was the older brother of Moses, was that of frogs. There was an infestation of frogs. And the frogs came up from the river and flooded through the houses and ate the food and were just absolutely disgusting. And people were just disgusted by this infestation of frogs. And the ancient peoples would have seen this as an insult against Heket, the Egyptian goddess of fertility and water and renewal. Heket, the Egyptian goddess, had the head of a frog. The third plague was having Aaron strike the dust. And when he did the dust became lice and infested the land. And both people and beasts were infested by lice. And this was an insult to Geb, the Egyptian god of the earth. The Egyptian god Geb was responsible for all the dust of the earth. And then the fourth Egyptian plague was that of flies that got into absolutely everything. And this insults Khepri, the Egyptian god of creation and of the movement of the sun and rebirth. Khepri, the Egyptian god, had, you guessed it, the head of a fly. the fifth Egyptian plague, Moses once again demanded of Pharaoh, "Let my people go that they may serve God," revealing the next Egyptian plague to occur. And this is a request for obedience. And with this one, we have a disease or pestilence that came upon the livestock, so that there were severe consequences, and a lot of the livestock died. And this would have insulted Hathor, the Egyptian god of love and protection. And usually this Egyptian god is depicted as having the head of a cow. But it was also getting pretty close to being personal. Because as we know, Thutmose III's firstborn son, we know from the inscription at the Temple of Karnak, had that strange title of overseer of the cattle. So this would also be a slap in the face of Pharaoh's household. The next plague is not announced. It just happens according to the book of Exodus. And this is an attack directly on the people themselves. And so Moses took ashes from the furnace of affliction and threw them into the air. As the dust of the ashes blew all over Israel, it settled on everyone, and they were infected by boils and sores. And for the ancients, they would have seen this as an insult of the goddess Isis, the Egyptian goddess of medicine and peace. The seventh plague was that of hail, of great size, that caused great destruction in the land. And this would be an insult to Nut, the Egyptian goddess of the sky. The eighth plague is that of locusts, and that's an insult to Set, the Egyptian god of storms and disorder. The ninth plague is that of darkness, and as darkness falls upon the land, this is getting even more personal, because the sun was the most worshipped god of Egypt, other than Pharaoh himself. And if the sun is blocked out, that's an insult to Ra, the sun god. And then we have the 10th plague, where Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, who was worshipped by the Egyptians because he was the greatest, considered the greatest Egyptian god of all, it was believed that he was actually the son of Ra, manifested in the flesh. And after the plague of darkness fell on the land, Pharaoh again resumes the position of bargaining with Moses, it said. And so with this darkness, here we have the 10th plague, which is where death comes over the land, and it's death of all the firstborn in the land. And this is where the idea of the Jewish Passover comes, because death passed over the Jewish households, or the Israelite households, and just afflicted the Egyptians. So here we have the insult of Pharaoh himself, the first son of Ra. And within this, then, presumably, we have the death of Amenemhat, the eldest son of Thutmose III, who held the title of overseer of the cattle. Now, to be clear, we don't know when Amenemhat died. All we know is that he died before Thutmose did, sometime within 20 years of the Exodus. within 20 years after the Exodus is when that would have happened. So, now, when people read the stories in the Bible, they tend to attribute magic and think magically about biblical literature, which is unfortunate. We tend to still look at this literature as a child, and we sensationalize things when maybe we shouldn't. And it's better to remember that this is Bronze Age literature. They're telling a story. But this isn't something new. Printing the legend is what people do. This happens in Canadian culture. This happens in American culture all the time. It is really the backbone of national pride. I just want to read a little bit from Byron Williams of the Huffington Post. He wrote something, when legend becomes fact. And he's not talking about anything to do with ancient history or anything. He's talking about modern media and modern culture. But this is what he reads, because it really is telling. One of my favorite movies, he writes, one of my favorite movie lines comes from the movie The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. Ransom Stoddard says, "You're not going to use the story, Mr. Scott?" And Scott replies, "No, sir. This is the West, sir. When the legend becomes fact, print the legend." Now, with all due respect to Mr. Scott, when the legend becomes fact, print the legend is not a phenomenon peculiar to the Wild West. It is a practice that at times undergirds public discourse. And Byron Williams here is talking about how we in the media today oftentimes let legend take over. And this is just a natural human thing that we like to do psychologically as human beings. And that's what often happens in the ancient world. But we do it all too often today as well. And so the quote from Byron Williams that I just read was actually talking about modern politics and media relations. It's a human enterprise. There's no doubt denying one fact. The legend of Moses is epic. So much so that every few years, a new movie is made about him. Back in the 70s, Richard Gere made a movie. Sorry, not Richard Gere. Richard Gere played David. In the 80s or 90s, there was a large epic about Moses. And again, just a few years ago, we had a movie called Gods and Kings that came out about Moses. Every few years, we have these stories. So it's an epic story. We know that. Now, if we take a look at this map, we see the record of the Exodus and the wandering. So the map on the left shows a little bit about the Exodus and the wanderings. Now, notice something. If we compare it to Thutmose III's extent of his reign on the map on the right and all the campaigns listed, notice something. The Exodus just skirts the edge of Egyptian influence. And it's logical then that they were simply avoiding the troubles of being on the Pharaoh's radar. Stay out of the sphere of Egypt. Stay in the wilderness where they can disappear into the landscape. No place to get trapped and crushed like Megiddo happened. And everyone would have known about what happened at Megiddo. So the account of the book of Numbers is that they stayed in this region outside the edge of the influence of Thutmose III for an entire generation. And historically, this makes sense, as Thutmose reigned for at least 20 more years after the purported time of the Exodus. Now note that the extravagant stories of conquest and escape are common in the ancient Near East. So the account of the story of the Exodus is actually very similar stylistically to what Thutmose III actually uses himself. For example, about a decade before the Exodus, Thutmose III had his campaign up in Megiddo. And remember, we talked about this a little bit last week. In that campaign, the official account goes like this. Thutmose III's commander and military scribe, who accompanied Thutmose, gave a journal detailing the engagement, and this scribe's account pleased Thutmose so much that he had portions of the inscription placed on the walls of the temple of Amun at Karnak, and to a lesser extent elsewhere. It goes like this. His Majesty commanded that the victories which his father Amun, so he's referring to the god Amun as his father, had given to him, should be established upon a monument in the temple which his Majesty had made for his father Amun, in order to set down each individual campaign, together with the booty which his Majesty carried off from it, and the dues of every foreign country which his father Ra had given him. His Majesty passed the fortress of Sile at the edge of the Egyptian frontier on the first campaign of victory which his Majesty made to extend the frontiers of Egypt in valor, in victory, in power, in justification. And then messages were brought in about that wretched enemy, and discussions continued about the problem, at which point the Majesty of the court said, life, prosperity, health, blessings upon, that Thutmose would have said to the assembly. I swear as Ra loves me, as my father Amun favors me, as my nostrils are rejuvenated with life and satisfaction, my Majesty shall proceed upon this Aruna road. Let him who wishes to go upon this road of which you speak, and let him who wishes to come to follow my Majesty, behold, they will say, these enemies whom Ra abominates, has his Majesty set upon another road because he has become afraid of us? So they will speak. They said in the presence of his Majesty, may thy father Amun, Lord of the thrones of the two lands, presiding over Karnak, act according to thy desire. Behold, we are following the Majesty everywhere that thy Majesty goes, and are a servant of our Lord. And it goes on and tells the story about how essentially Thutmose III personally rode into battle and defeated all of these people at Megiddo. Now, as you can see, this self-aggrandizement and the attribution to gods was the order of the day for telling accounts. So it stands to reason that the Semite peoples should have similar edits within their story. That's all that I wanted to kind of point out there. Now, In the time from 1444 BCE to about 1406 BC, we have the account of the Book of Numbers and the Book of Leviticus. The Book of Numbers really recounts a census that took place and telling of, as they got into the wilderness, how they counted up the people, how they organized the people, and really kind of structured the people in a semi-nomadic community. They also established some state laws within this community to create an identity of a proto-nation. So this is a semi-nomadic nation. And here as well in the book of Exodus, you have the story of the very famous Ten Commandments. The book of Leviticus is a little bit different, but has some of the same style that you would have in things like the Law Code of Hammurabi. And it was set to speak about the role of the priestly class and how the priestly class would serve as public servants in order to help create identity, in order to mete out justice, in order to be public health officers as well. And within this is a theme that really carries through Proto-Israel for the next several hundred years. And it's a blessings and curses contract between the divine and the people. So it's the same kind of idea that you have in other cultures where you have this vassal suzerain contract kind of idea. You have this same thing happening similarly in Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28, where you have the blessings and curses, which is basically saying, if you follow these laws, things will go well for you. If you don't, things will not go well. And probably the one thing that is most similar to this would be, that we've talked about at least in this class, would be the curse of Akkad, where Naram Sin had dishonored the temple of El. Vinal, and how that had caused a curse upon the land. This is the same kind of idea that kind of comes out here. And this idea, though, really ties into part of the later history of Israel. And so we'll take a look at that in weeks to come. Now, the book of Joshua is focused upon, it recounts the role of Moses' general after Moses dies. The people are still nomadic, and they are looking to now take control of some land that are on the edge, technically under the control of Egypt. How are they going to do this? Well, first off, they're fortunate that things are starting to weaken in Egypt. Thutmose III is no longer alive. His successors are not nearly as interested in putting down troubles on their borders. And so within this, you have a conquest that focuses on the highlands. Now, it's important to note here that the book of Joshua really highlights that they're focusing upon the highlands. And that's significant because Egyptian strength was really along the coast. So this avoids that. Their major forts were along the coast. And it's fairly clear that the main goal of this Proto-Israelite population was to displace the hinterland population surrounding the cities. And really to defeat or absorb these semi-nomadic peoples that lived around the city-states into their identity. And that ties in very strongly with what a lot of scholars think happened. So it's not that everyone in these populations was directly descended from Abraham, for example, because there was, even in the Levitical laws, ways that foreigners could be adopted into the family. So that is part of this as well. Now, what we see when we look at the literature in the book of Joshua, and we look at the type of conquests that they made, something striking comes up very clearly, and that is the main focus of the conquest is actually to gain control of fortified ruins. So they have a few fortified sites that have strong natural springs and strong, well-established cisterns. What they were trying to do was gain control of the water in the hinterland. When you have control of the water, then you have a population that can thrive and can be strong. Without water, you can't survive. So that was the goal. Now, I also want to highlight here that the literary and textual evidence is that this isn't something that just happens in one campaign, and they do it all nice and neat in one shot and it's done. It's the textual and literary evidence, the way that the stories are told, the way that the stories are tied together. It really does look like there was numerous small campaigns that took place over a period of years, and these were then connected together in the final story as being part of a larger campaign. And it was probably a bunch of disjointed campaigns that all kind of went together here. Now, a little bit about, because one of the first things that they did, they came in from the east side of the Jordan, they crossed the Jordan, and the first place that they try to gain control of is Jericho. Now, to be clear, generally their goal was not to take over cities. They were still looking to live in the hinterland, but they needed control of the water. A little bit about Jericho. It's one of the oldest and lowest cities in the world. And Jericho is known as one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world. It's also considered one of the lowest cities in the world. It sits about 800 feet below sea level. Now, as far as the walls in Jericho, the site of ancient Jericho is in Tel es-Sultan, and it's been excavated by 4 different teams over about a period of about 100 years, starting in the early 20th century. And Jericho City 4 is the name of the particular strata of the mound that we're interested in here with the book of Joshua. Now, this late Bronze Age Jericho had been a Hyksos city, or at least connected with the Hyksos in some way. So if you have the Hyksos being part of Proto-Israel, there's some connections that are going to be there right off the bat. But remember, not all people that identified as Proto-Israel, or not all Hyksos, were identified as Proto-Israel. That's the point I wanted to make there. Now, this layer of the city has been found to have been extensively fortified by both stone and mud brick walls. There is a spring that is to the east side of the city, and this Bronze Age city, it would have been inside the walls. So they need to get inside the walls to get control of the spring. Now, the stone walls surrounding this city measured about 15 feet high. And on top of that was a parapet wall of mud brick. that was about, so the stone wall was about 4 to 5 meters high, and then the mud brick on top of that was another 2 meters, up to 4 meters high. So you have this fairly tall structure there. And we see that this collapses in different parts anyways. And according to the story in Jericho, there's a short siege, and then this dramatic story where the walls fall down and the Proto-Israel army rushes in. What we have from the archaeology is this. From this layer, there's evidence of the city being destroyed by a huge and likely purposeful fire. There's a layer of ash that's about 1 meter thick, so it's about 3 feet thick. So there was a massive fire that went through the city. Now, the evidence for the pottery is that this happens around within 50 years of the time that we would expect it to happen according to the Jericho story. And so the Jericho was depopulated for a time, it appears, and then started to rebuild again. And so you have layers build up again. So I just want you to kind of be aware of that. Now, there's also, after according to the book of Joshua, after they conquer Jericho, then they go and attack Ai. Now, here's where things get complicated, because if you just read the text as the city of Ai, you might get confused, because when you look at the archaeology, there's no evidence for there being a late Bronze Age city at this place called Et Tel, or Ai. There was a fortified settlement there from 3100 BCE to about 2400 BCE, and then it was abandoned for the most part. There wasn't an established city there, but there was stone walls. There was a large working, very strong cistern at this site. So there was water there. And some have argued that because there wasn't a settlement here, then the text must be wrong. The other thing is that there's a term that's used here for king, the king of Melech, and the king of Ai, and the term there is Melech, which just means the head guy. It doesn't have to be a king sitting on a throne with a crown. Just the head guy for this group that they're fighting. So when you look at that, you can start to see, okay, so there was a group of semi-nomadic people that used this site. Now here's the other interesting thing. The term Ai actually means the ruins. So in the text itself, the best way to have it translated would be this. The Canaanite people were defending themselves at the ruins, and Joshua sent up part of his army to attack them. So that is the best interpretation. And when you look at it that way, then it makes sense. There didn't need to be a city there. It was the hinterland people that were using this old ruined fort as a place of defense. And according to Joshua, it worked as a great defense during the first attack. And the Proto-Israelite army was actually defeated there. But with a little bit of strategy, both Ai and an allied city, Bethel, which likely controlled the hinterland and wanted to protect the hinterland people there, were defeated. In the defeat of Ai, the Proto-Israelite people get a steeped hill with walls on three sides, and they also gain control of a water supply, the cisterns, which is consistent with their strategy, the same strategy that they used all the way through, gain control of the water. Now, I don't think I need to go into that anymore, but if you have any interest in the archaeology of this time period or in the literary structure, and the literary structure is fascinating, but it's very complex, and it's not something that we need to be talking about in this lecture. But I did write a book about it years ago. The book is called Myth, God, and War, and it really goes into depth about the textual nuances. So if you ever have any interest, please feel free to look at that book. It's a heavy read, but if it's something that interests you, it certainly, you won't look at these Bronze Age texts the same way ever again. I can promise you that. So, Proto-Israel, then. From the time of 1390 through to 1200 BCE, they continue to live as primarily semi-nomadic people. According to researchers, for example, one fellow by the name of Israel Finkelstein, there was a tendency for nomads to settle down and to become sedentary populations to become nomadic. That kind of thing happens in the Middle East all the time. And so this is an understandable thing. Slowly, though, you see in the archaeological record something happen. At different shrine sites that were considered holy to Proto-Israel, you start to see the bones of sheep and goats, very little cattle, and almost a complete absence of pig bones at excavated sites. And notice that in the Mosaic Law, pigs are forbidden. So we have some circumstantial evidence that these Proto-Israelite people were living in this area at this time from 1390 through to 1200 BCE. Now, there's also some more interesting Egyptian contextual evidence. At 1353 to 1335 BCE, there was a pharaoh by the name of Amenhotep IV. And for the first 5 years of his reign, he was very traditional. But in the 5th year of his reign, he undertook a very dramatic religious conversion, and he devoted himself to the cult of Amun, and to that of Aten. And for the next 12 years of his reign, he became famous or infamous as the heretic king. And what Amenhotep IV does, first off, he changes his name to Akhenaten. He also institutes the first known monotheistic state religion in the world. And some would argue that he establishes monotheism himself. Sigmund Freud was fascinated by Akhenaten and even argued that there was a connection between Moses and Akhenaten. That's just pure conjecture, but there's an interesting contextual thing that's happening here. Now, his reign is known as the Amarna period because he moved the capital of Egypt from its traditional site at Thebes to the city of Amarna, what we know as Tel El Amarna now. And this Amarna period, we've talked about this already, was a very controversial period in this time. Now, what is going on in this time, in the period before Akhenaten, so in the reign of his father as well as his reign, it's not just that the Pharaoh becomes a monotheist, but there are records from the region of Canaan, from the kings of the cities in this region, complaining about the Semitic people coming in and attacking and harassing the hinterland. And essentially what they're saying is this: my Lord, my King, my God. And you've read this all in articles already about how the lower kings of Canaan would really kind of grovel at the feet of the Pharaoh. Please send archers, they said, to help protect us from the Habiru that harass our walls and hinterlands. Now, the Habiru is an interesting term. It's a term to describe a Semitic people that give you a tough time. It's a generic term. But note the language of Proto-Israel. And even in modern Israel today, it is Hebrew. Israel refers to itself as the Hebrew people. So you have this connection that goes on. And as you see in the journal article that you're reading for this week, not all Habiru are Israelite or Proto-Israelite, but all Proto-Israelite are Habiru. And here is the Hebrew language, and we'll just take a few moments and kind of look at that because it's a fascinating language. A few differences between ancient Hebrew and modern Hebrew. First off, the Hebrew language is a West Semitic language, so roughly akin with Eblaite, but still distinct enough to be its own language. But it has some things in common with other languages of the region, and a few things about ancient Hebrew. First, it is written from the right to the left, unlike English, which is left to right. So you read it backwards. And it also did not have vowels. Now, modern Hebrew has vowels because that makes knowing how to pronounce something much easier. But just kind of go through all of these. So the first letter is Aleph. So you start in the upper right-hand corner, Aleph, and then Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Het, Vav, Zayin, Chet, Tet, Yod, Kof. And there's two versions of Kof. Kof, the first version of Kof is what you use throughout the word, and then the second version is what you use at the end of a word, and it looks different, but it's the same letter. Then Lamet, Mem, and the same thing for Mem. There's two versions of Mem, one at the middle of the word, one at the end of the word. And then Nun, again, one at the middle, one at the end. Samech, Ayin, Pe, Fe, Tzadeh, and Pe is again the same kind of thing. Tzadeh, Kaf, Resh, Shin, and then Shin, Sin. In modern Hebrew, there are two different letters. There's a little vowel that gets put, or a little dot that gets put in to distinguish between Shin and Sin, and then Tau is the last letter. So just a little bit about the Hebrew language so that you're kind of aware of the differences there. Now, we get to the book of Judges. Now, the book of Judges recounts a period between 1300 and 1100 BCE. And this is the seventh book in the Hebrew Bible, or in the Christian Old Testament. It is the narrative. In the narrative of the Hebrew Bible, it covers the time between the conquest. And remember, the conquest wasn't a real organized thing. It was a series of campaigns, or textually at least it looks like it was a series of campaigns. This kind of helps tell the story of the book of Judges, helps to tell the story of what was going on as this Proto-Israelite people were transitioning from a nomadic life to not yet sedentary, not yet an urban population, but settling down a bit. We start to see some evidence of a distinct Proto-Israelite pottery in some sedentary sites during this time. And we also have evidence of them developing a sense of national or at least regional identity. And again, the book of Judges is very clearly a conglomerate of stories and sources, and there's a lot of evidence for later redactors and editors within this. So just be mindful of that. Now, what a judge is. A judge in this ancient Israel, late Bronze Age, was really a temporary military leader. Somebody that would rally the people to develop strength for the Israelite people, to protect them against all the regional powers that are going. And remember, each city-state in the surrounding area had their own desires and political policies, and all of them had some kind of relationship with one of the superpowers of the region. Now, Egypt is in significant decline here, but the Hittites are growing in power, and at this time the Philistines seem to be fairly strong, and they're gaining some independence from the Egyptians. So all of this kind of plays in with what's going on in Israel. Now, during this time as well, or in the midst of this as well, we have some more extra textual evidence. One of them is the Merneptah Stela, also known as the Israel Stela or the Victory Stela of Merneptah. And on an inscription by the Egyptian pharaoh Merneptah, who reigned from 1213 to 1203 BCE, this stele was discovered in 1896 in Thebes and is currently located in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. Now, the text is largely an account of Merneptah's victory over peoples to the north of Proto-Israel, so in Libya and their allies. But the last three of the 28 lines with a separate speak of a separate campaign in Canaan, which was, as you recall, part of the imperial possessions of the superpower of Egypt. And the stele is sometimes referred to as the Israel stele because the majority of scholars translate a set of hieroglyphs in line 27 as Israel. So the stele represents the earliest textual reference to Israel, and really the only reference from ancient Egypt of Israel. And Merneptah claims to have had a victory over Israel during this time period. So here's just another example of the extra biblical insight into what's going on here. Now, you may have heard the story of Samson. I just want to kind of highlight this because a lot of people know about Samson. Samson is another one like Moses that people tend to know about. Samson, what you may not know is that according to the account, Samson was a Nazirite. According to Mosaic law, to be a Nazirite was something that an adult male might do for a month or a year. And it's basically you have to eat special foods and you don't cut your hair for a period of time so that people know that you have dedicated yourself to being pure for a period of time. Now that's how it goes according to Mosaic law. The record says that that Samson was dedicated as a Nazirite from birth, which is odd. But and I don't know if that's a later edit or if that is something that actually happened. But what we do know is that, and I have no reason to doubt this, the story of Samson is not a flattering story, really, of a man of character. And for those that are raised in the Jewish or Christian tradition, you've probably heard of Samson as this holy man that was given great power by God to defeat the enemies of Israel. Really, though, if you read the text, Samson was basically a psychopath serial killer. He showed, and all the qualities of a psychopath serial killer, personality traits this guy seems to have displayed. He had no concern for others. He had no allegiance. He showed no remorse, and was simply obsessed with his own desires. Now, according to Judges, Samson killed many Philistines during his life, but after being blinded, he was imprisoned and brought into a Philistine temple. And it said that he stood between two pillars and was given strength to push them over, and in pushing them over, he killed more in his death than he had in his life. Now, according to the accounts, he killed, 1,000 people in his life and another 2,000 people in his death. And that sounds extraordinary. And there are, over the years, there have been many movies made out of Samson. In fact, there's a movie that just came out about Samson a few months ago. Another Hollywood movie, and that really kind of plays this up. Now, if in the lower right-hand corner, I have a picture of an archaeological site in Gath. Gath is would be near the Mediterranean coast, and interestingly, they found an example of a Philistine temple at the site. And what it seems to have been is you have a bit of a sanctuary, and then you have two pillars, and on top of those two pillars would have been a large wooden balcony that would have held up people. So if you pushed over those pillars, the balcony would have collapsed and people would have been killed. That's fairly clear. And wouldn't you know it, if you look closely in that picture, you have the foundations for two stone pillars, just like was described in the book of Judges. Now, I want to be clear about something, so just so you're not confused here, this is not the temple that is spoken of in the book of Judges, but what the archaeology, because this is in the region of Gath, which is not where the record says that that Samson had this happen. But the archaeologists do say that it's interesting that the architectural design of this temple with its two central pillars is reminiscent of the architectural image that is described in the well-known biblical story of Samson and the Philistines, when Samson knocks down the temple by standing between the pillars and pushing them down. So, just leave that as it is. Now, this brings us to the establishment of Israel as the beginnings of a nation. Now, you have to kind of remember Israel Up until this point, I've been speaking of Proto-Israel because there isn't a lot of evidence that they really kind of saw themselves as a unified nation. They were semi-nomadic people that were struggling in these loose alliances to survive in the hinterland or in the hill country where there were some fairly strong city-states. And they didn't really control any city-states. But then we have the story of choosing the kings of these tribes of Israel. The first king being Saul. So Saul probably lived between 1080 and 1012 BCE. What we know from the story of Saul is that he tended to be emotionally unstable, and eventually Saul was in a battle and committed suicide, fell on his sword after fighting with the Philistines. From that point on, we have a power struggle that takes place. There's between Saul's only surviving son, Ishbosheth, and Saul's son-in-law, David. And David seems to come out on top in this. And in many ways, David is a legendary figure in his own right, ruling from 1012 BCE to 972 BCE. His reputation was one of being a great warrior. If you know the story of David and Goliath, you have this, when he was working as a musician for Saul, he is said to have gone up against the great military giant that was representing the Philistines. And, think in terms of, there was in the 1970s and 80s, there was a professional wrestler by the name of Andre the Giant. Goliath would have been a few inches taller, maybe a foot taller than Andre the Giant, but probably of a similar build. From time to time, there are people that have uncontrolled hormonal growth, and it eventually kills them, but they can grow to be 7, 8, 9 feet tall. So, for example, Andre the Giant, when he was 12 years old, was 6'7" and 300 pounds, and then he continued to grow until he died in his early 40s. So, David, it said, defeated Goliath of Gath. He then became a prince, married Saul's daughter, eventually becomes king, and establishes, and in the midst of all of this, establishes Jerusalem, Ur-Salem. Remember, Ur means city, so the city of Salem is Jerusalem. Establishes this as the seat of Israelite power. So now Israel has a city, a capital city to call their own. So then it's at that point that you can really say, okay, now we have a nation. So up until this point, it's Proto-Israel. Now that they have a capital city, now we can call this a real nation. David is known in biblical tradition as being one of the major writers of the book of Psalms. So if you read the book of Psalms in the Bible, a lot of those are attributed to David. After David dies, we have King Solomon. King Solomon was a son of David, and he's known as being the wise, rich, and famous king. Now, in the biblical literature, Solomon is attributed, there's a section of the Old Testament known as wisdom literature. So books like Proverbs, Song of Songs, and Ecclesiastes are all attributed to Solomon. Now, after Solomon's the one that built the first temple and kind of solidifies the religious order of Israel. Now, Israel and Israelite political life was a little bit different from other places in the ancient Near East. There was a close connection to the divine and the political power, but they were distinct from each other. Whereas the rest of the ancient world tried to unite those two together. So, like, for example, in Egypt, you have the Pharaoh being a god. There was a distinction that happened in Israel that was fairly unique. Now, the thing is, while Solomon really kind of establishes the kingdom through different alliances and whatnot, and you have this period of peace and growth, he did tax people fairly heavily. And up until this point, they weren't used to being taxed. So they weren't happy about being taxed. And so when Solomon dies, there's a dispute. And Solomon's son is only able to control the region of his tribe, Judah. So Judah becomes the southern kingdom. So the region around Jerusalem becomes known as Judah, and the region north of that becomes known as Israel, and that is ruled by other kings. And so from that point on, you have a divided kingdom. So you have Israel in the north, Judah in the south. They both grew out of Proto-Israel, but they're now distinct. So from about 931, the dates vary a little bit there. You have these two parallel nations living together for the next several hundred years. And we'll look a little bit at that because the Assyrian Empire plays a significant role in the lives of both Israel and Judah for the next several hundred years. So we'll explore that a bit next week. But that's it for our lecture for today.